All right, everyone. So we are going to get started. My name is Spencer, and I work at the Colorado Department of Higher Ed. Here's the Director of Educational Innovation, and this is part of the Colorado Open Education Ambassadors Program workshop series. And so what you have on the screen now, if you're following along on your computers, is a list of our other training and workshop opportunities that we have going on throughout the term. And so this is inclusive of fall semester. We have some great speakers from kind of all over the country joining us. And so I hope you all can join us for another one of these sessions sometime in the near future. One thing I wanted to note about today's session is being recorded so that we can share it out with others. So if you just please keep that in mind, and if you want to share this afterwards, you're welcome to share this afterwards with colleagues. I know there were some folks who weren't able to attend, and we'll go ahead and put that on the website as well. So today we are super excited to have Sabia Prescott joining us. Sabia is a Senior Program Associate with the Education Policy Program at New America. Prior to joining New America, Sabia served as the Media Policy Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania Center for Global Communication Studies and as an English annotator in the Linguistic Data Consortium. She holds a BA in Linguistics from the University of Mary Washington and is currently pursuing a Master's of Public Administration at the George Washington University. And today, Sabia is going to talk to us a little bit more about open education inclusion, and specifically LGBTQ, and what types of resources are available to queer students and their allies in colleges and universities. So we're super excited to have Sabia here. You know, she had written an article and I think put that out back earlier this year. We reached out and connected with her, and she was willing to present to the folks here in Colorado. So without further ado, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Sabia. I'm gonna make you the host. So let's go ahead and make sure that works. And I think you'll be able to share your screen at that point.
Got it. All right. Thank you, Spencer. And hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and for caring about this. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about this work and think a little bit more about what this looks like in higher education, because a lot of my work here at New America, as Spencer mentioned, has been pre-K-12 focused. But he and I have been talking a lot about how there are really relevant applications in higher ed. And so I'm pretty excited about that. So I am going to stop my video then and share this presentation with you all. Let's see how it works. Possibly. There we go. So you shall see, I'm going to minimize that. You should now see a slide that says supporting LGBTQ inclusive teaching. Does everyone see that? Or does anyone see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, I'll dive into it. Oh, maybe there we go. So as Spencer mentioned, my name is Sophia Prescott. My pronouns are she and hers. I work within a much larger program here at New America called the Education Policy Program, but within that, I work specifically on a smaller team called Teaching, Learning, and Tech. And a lot of the work we do is around OER, but also just digital materials more broadly, primarily focused in K-12 and thinking about how more and more open licensing and digital materials can be used to improve outcomes for students and for teachers. So before I sort of dive into the nitty-gritty of this, I did want to just paint a broader picture, I think, of the problem that we're talking about and some evidence of it. So first of all, around 10% of undergraduate students enrolled in universities in 2016 identified as LGBTQ. And depending on which research you're looking at, which report, this number will change a little bit. Sorry. Oh no, I'll go back. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make sure that comment wasn't for me. Can everyone hear me and see this okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, distracted by the comments. About 10% for undergraduate students. And like I said, this number changes a little bit depending on where you're looking, but the point is that it's not 1%, right, and it's not 50%. So about 10% of the population is what we're working with typically. In 2017, only 26% of campuses prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation. And that, unfortunately, is something that is not unique to higher ed. Legal protections and sort of policy and district level protections are something that K-12 schools struggle a lot with, as well as organizations and private sector as well. And then finally, a study by the National LGBTQ Task Force found that almost 30% of university students did not feel that their curriculum adequately represents the contributions of LGBTQ people and stories. And this is something where OER can come in, especially in where I'm going to talk about the majority of this presentation. And so before I jump into that, I did want to make a note just about language and offer some sort of shared language that I'll be using throughout this and I use in this work, just so we're all on the same page. So LGBTQ is short for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And all except for transgender, all those words in there except for transgender are sexuality markers, right, versus transgender, which is a gender marker. And then queer itself has different meanings for different folks. Some people use it synonymously with LGBTQ as a sort of umbrella term for gender and sexual minorities. For other people, it does have a very specific sort of identity marker meaning. In this work and in this presentation, I use queer and LGBTQ synonymously, primarily just so that I don't have to say that string of letters 5 times in a sentence. And then transgender refers to someone whose gender identity does not align with the sex they were assigned at birth, right? For example, if you were assigned male when you were born, you now identify as a woman. Cisgender or cis is just the opposite. People whose gender does align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. This is the majority of the population. And non-binary refers to someone who doesn't identify as male or female. So non-binary folks could identify as both male or female, neither, or something completely outside of that. I did want to just make the point again that sexual orientation and gender identity are not the same thing. And this matters especially when we're talking about how they're covered legally, how they're understood by the public, and how they're defined in things like education policies, because this can be very different. So with that, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the broader context for this work, because there's really these 3 main pieces of this that are the reasons that we're focusing on this work in particular, and the reasons that we see other folks in education space, both in pre-K-12 and in higher ed, sort of moving towards this. So the first piece is this growing push towards culturally responsive teaching, right, which recognizes students' diverse experiences and abilities in school as tools for learning rather than deficits. And within this sort of recognition that experiences and identities of all students are valid and real. The second is a just general increasing awareness of LGBTQ issues and a push towards wanting to do more for these students among teachers and faculty. And this is something with mostly only anecdotal evidence at this point, but I think it's clear when you look at the number of resources that were available for these students even 5 years ago compared. This is really easy to see in pre-K-12 with organizations like Listen, Teaching Tolerance, and others who are creating a lot of student-facing materials, but not so many teacher-facing materials. I think the same case could be made for higher ed, where you're seeing more and more sort of classes and professors and course materials acknowledging these things, but not quite at the point of getting into depth about them or necessarily getting them quite right. And then the last one is, despite this fact, outcomes for LGBTQ students are still getting worse. In fact, they're getting worse for the first time in 10 years, according to a GLSEN survey in pre-K-12. And one of the biggest things I run up against in this work is the idea that the world is just generally becoming a more accepting place, right? So doing nothing will still mean that eventually these students are going to be okay. And this just isn't true. There's very real action that is needed right now. So it really all starts with this broad problem, right? That traditional education systems aren't designed for LGBTQ students. For a lot of queer and trans students, school might be the only safe place for them. Some might be unable to come out to their parents until they no longer rely on them financially, for example, to pay for school. For youth who are unable to come out to their parents or guardians, college campuses might be the first time they've ever been in a place where they can be themselves, right? Where they can see themselves validated. This process of self-actualization and realization is tolling. It's really difficult, and it goes on for a long time. And it might start when kids are in college, but it certainly doesn't end there. And so supporting students going through this process is a really critical piece to their academic and mental well-being. And so when they're not supported in these ways in pre-K-12, this can look like poor educational outcomes, right? There's an achievement gap, as it were, between LGBTQ students and non-LGBTQ students. They graduate at lower rates than non-LGBTQ students, and they face much higher rates of bullying and mental health issues. In higher ed, this can look like students being less likely to attend college in the first place, right? If high school looked like that, and they don't necessarily have parents or guardians to help facilitate that transition into maybe even a harsher environment, that's probably not going to be something that they're likely going to take on themselves. It can look like just continued lower academic and social engagement, students being reserved even from clubs or organizations on campus that might be validating of them, even if those things exist, just because they haven't been a part of that before. And again, if you're at this point of realizing all of this for yourself, and you're feeling isolated, you're probably not going to just make that jump into that type of environment alone without any kind of financial or academic support. And then lastly, just this lack of understanding, right, by faculty and administration. This, I think, is the biggest parallel between pre-K-12 and higher ed, which is just often the people that students need most to support them and to understand them, or even just to hear them, may not be willing to, or even when they are willing to, just might not know how, right? There's so little to prepare teachers and faculty to have these conversations with students. And I was talking to someone just yesterday who asked me sort of what sort of quick or easy things or teachers can begin to do for students to let them know that they're a safe person to talk to. And I have talked to professors who are asking me this too, and folks always want to know sort of what the 3 things they can do are, right? And these safe space stickers, you might know what I'm talking about. There's rainbow stickers usually that say this is a safe space for LGBTQ students, right? That a lot of teachers in pre-K-12 will put on their classroom doors or windows. This is not something I ever say because there's no insurance for students that teachers or faculty or administrators are actually prepared to have these conversations, right? These can be really intense conversations, and then you have information that maybe no one else has about that student, and you're in a position of guiding them through that. And I think that's not only the case in high school. I think that continues well throughout college and into people's adult lives. And so faculty who are looking to be that person for students as well, or for other faculty or administrators, really need to be prepared somehow in order to have those conversations. So a few of the causes of this problem, as I see it, are personal bias, first of all, right? Just an unwillingness or unacceptance, misunderstanding of LGBTQ folks and the challenges that they face. I do list this one first because I kind of skim by it, because personal bias and intolerance certainly exist, right? They exist structurally and personally on a lot of levels and in a lot of parts of the country, but I don't think this is the biggest barrier to this work. I argue in this work that structural and technical challenges are actually the biggest piece of this. The second piece is state and federal policies, right? Restricting the rights. There are 6 states where teachers are not allowed to say LGBTQ allowed in the classroom. And that's a big deal. And that's something that raises a lot of eyebrows when I say that. And I try to say it as much as possible because it's true. And it just, I think, highlights the really large challenges that still exist and the lack of knowledge around them. And then lastly, just a severe lack of representation and support, right? Both in the curriculum and in classrooms. And this is the one that we're going to talk about the most today, and where OER, I think, comes in, the most. So the first type of representation I like to talk about is in the curriculum, right? In the text that we're teaching and what students are learning through their different course materials. And so there are in higher ed, there's sort of evidence of where this type of inclusion is happening in which types of degrees are being offered and which courses, right? So a little more than 200 US colleges and universities, it's the last number I read, offer gender and sexuality studies majors to undergraduates. Only 4 offer LGBTQ specific majors. But creating new majors and minors isn't the only course of action a school can take to create more inclusive learning environments. There's a range of options, right, from creating courses relevant to gender and sexuality across disciplines, which might be especially useful for students who might not otherwise self-select into a gender studies major. And this sort of material comes up across all topic areas, right? Politics, anthropology, sociology, psychology. It's truly everywhere. Doesn't only have to sort of appear in the form of queer history and gender studies majors or theory or things like that. And many schools already do have courses like this, but schools can also include LGBTQ stories and events, perspectives in courses that aren't specifically about gender and sexuality. And this type of inclusion, I think, in many ways is needed the most because queer people shouldn't only be represented in courses with topics specifically about them, right? So there are really 2 types of inclusive curricula, that which is specifically about queer history and narratives and stories, and those that just use inclusive language, right? In pre-K-12, and I would argue in higher ed as well, this can look like, same-sex names when they appear in families in math word problems, right? It can appear in including different options for books or stories written by queer authors in every topic area you could think of. It appears, like I said, it appears in biology, psychology, sociology, lots of courses that have been long taught at universities that could better include it this way. And the other piece of this is social representation, right? How do faculty and administrators create inclusive learning environments beyond the texts that students are reading in the ways that they engage with students in the types of organizations and opportunities that are offered on campus? And sort of the three ways for doing this that I come back to often are, 1, not to rely on your queer and trans staff and students to lead this charge, right? It shouldn't be up to those who are most directly impacted by the problems that you're facing on campus to solve those problems, right? That's the definition of marginalization. So if you have some privilege in this area and some mental capacity to take it on, I encourage you to start these conversations and see what's going on in this area in your campus. Second of all is to encourage continuous learning around identity and privilege among all faculty and staff. This is work that has a low barrier of entry, and I believe that. But it is easy to get in, but you can't stop. This is by definition sort of a continuous learning process. And then the last one is respect language, right? Don't memorize it. Important, again, so that we have a shared language for this conversation and for this. Or making people feel like the point is truly to respect the humanity of folks that you're talking to and trying to understand the perspectives of. So this might sound like a lot, right? But like I said, there really is a low barrier of entry to inclusion work, and it doesn't all happen at once. It's an ongoing process for everyone involved. Making small but intentional changes can make a world of difference for people whose identities are constantly ignored and forgotten and invalidated. And it's highly possible that the language doing this unintentionally, right? Completely unintentionally. I think, like I said, the bias I've never found is the biggest piece of this, rather than people just not knowing what changes to make or how to be better at this. These suggestions that I have here on the screen aren't rules by any means, but just rather suggestions for getting in the habit of using language more intentionally. This takes practice for everyone, including me. But a good rule of thumb is just to never assume anything about anyone. Don't assume you know someone's gender or pronouns based on their name or how they look or how they sound, right? Especially if you don't belong to the LGBTQ community. Understanding your own privilege in conversations is really critical. Privilege looks really different in different spaces, and it can create power dynamics between you and the person you're trying to engage, even if it's unintentional. This comes up a lot in conversations with professors and students, or administrators and professors, right? Conversations where one person there's a power dynamic there regardless of gender or sexuality or race or anything else. Because of the roles that you're in, there's going to be more added layers if we're talking about the added sort of privilege overlays, right, of gender and sexuality. And I say understanding here and not acknowledging, because this doesn't mean that you have to go out of your way to point out your privilege or how much you understand that you have it, right? Every time you're talking with a queer person. Rather, just understanding it yourself, for yourself, with yourself, and the dynamics that it creates is really key. And so this can be done through materials, right? By looking carefully at who has a chance to author content. Author the content you're teaching or the content you're suggesting or editing, whatever that is and whatever that looks like. Which content they're authoring, right? Is it about a group of people to which they don't belong? Is it about a group of people to which they do belong, but that's not made clear maybe to those who are reading it? And you can think about this too in how the ways that we seek out authors, right? Especially when we're talking about OER, where more than just one person or a handful of people by virtue of position might have the chance to author things, right? How are we selecting those authors and why and what goes into that and who makes that decision? Because that all really impacts what the text is going to look like. Queer folks are experts on their own experiences, right? Open source content really provides a unique opportunity to hear more voices. And other than the starting points that I have here on the screen, these can be adopted in speech and in writing as well. I guarantee that if you picked any textbook off a shelf and went through it with the intention of making all the gendered language in it gendered, you'd be shocked at how at how many edits you would have to it. It's seemingly small things like that that can make a really big difference to students. And so since I have a lot of text on here, I'll just go through these quickly. Like I just said, intentionally use non-gendered language. This can look like everyone or students or faculty or y'all, depending, maybe in Colorado you don't say y'all too much, but in place of phrases like ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, right, you guys, this can make a much bigger impact than you might know to students. Ask for pronouns the first time you meet people and tell them what yours are, right? I do this at the beginning of every talk, every conversation that I have, and I don't do it because I think that people might not know that I identify as a woman if I don't say them, but rather because I'm cisgendered and I have the privilege of normalizing this. So if you also share that privilege, then I encourage you to help normalize that as well. And then lastly, like I said, I have this on multiple sides because it's such a big one. Just remain willing to learn and to be uncomfortable in this, to recognize your own privilege and how it plays out in different conversations that you may be having. And so aside from the benefits of OER that we all know, right, cost savings, time, there's some benefits to using it for LGBTQ inclusion that are specific to the challenges that this community faces. So usually when we do see queer narratives in text, it's only one voice, right? Usually the most privileged among us who are representing that group. For the queer community, that looks like wealthy, white, maybe flamboyant, cisgender gay men, right? That sort of stereotypical gay man. And this voice alone doesn't begin to represent all LGBTQ people and the challenges that they face, but when it's the only one that we have, we think it does. So openly licensed materials really allow for more voices to be heard, a true diversity of voices within a community, great for more authors to exist, like I mentioned, and just more stories to be told. And this is a really critical part of communicating the nuance and diversity and challenges of a whole community, because it really is a whole diverse community with different opinions and different experiences, right? And capturing that in text, I think, is just as important as having the text in the first place. And OER's ability to be edited and adapted is really particularly useful for creating and adapting content for a local context, right? So with openly licensed materials in higher ed, general content like language and historical themes could be connected to local queer history, events, movements, right? Anything you could think of. If you think to yourself right now, what sort of queer historical events have happened in your neighborhood or your town or your university, I would venture to guess that those would be hard to think of. And there's a reason. And it's not just because you don't know, it's because probably you've never been taught those things. And so I think OER really is an opportunity for that. And then finally, OER creates the opportunity for us to update this content regularly, which is really key to this, this content specifically. So our ideas and understandings and the language that we have to describe queer identities changes over time, and having the ability to keep materials relevant and updated to match that understanding is really important, right? We see this playing out in pre-K-12 a lot, where more and more districts who use proprietary textbooks are beginning to update those textbooks to match our understanding of these identities now. And then these are textbooks that they're going to use for the next maybe 20 years, right? And so think about 20 years ago from right now, and how less understood or normalized talking about this content was, right? If you can imagine how LGBTQ identities might have been talked about in textbooks 20 years ago, right now, it's going to be the same thing for those textbooks 20 years from now, right? It's not going to begin to reflect a current or relevant understanding of these identities. And in my opinion, that's almost as good as doing nothing, right? If we have very outdated and sort of painfully irrelevant information, that's not a whole lot better. So OER really offers the chance for not accuracy, as in there's a wrong answer, but accuracy as in understanding sort of where the movement is at and how people are talking about these ideas. And so I am careful in this work also a lot to not wholesale advertise for OER, because I do believe that there are challenges to it. It presents a lot of opportunities, but I also think that there are a set of challenges just as unique as the potential benefits are. And so the first one here is I really think there's a danger in not committing to this work as an ongoing, starting it, thinking that anything is enough, right? Thinking that we have that one voice and that's good, and we've checked off the gay box and that's fine, and then we stop doing this work. This creates sort of a sense that inclusion work, first of all, is a one and done thing, which it certainly isn't. But secondly, it creates this paradigm, right, in which the one, again, the most privileged voice within the community speaks for the entire community. And that's the voice we see. And that just leads to more misunderstanding of an entire community than it does good, right? Second of all, this really bleeds into the second one, which is how do we make sure that this content is actually representative of the community as a whole? There are a lot of ethical questions, I think, here involved in how much representation is, quote, enough, right? How much do we focus on this one group versus other marginalized groups? Where's the overlap? Where are the intersections here? Who gets to decide what those things are, and in what contexts and to what degrees, right? And not only that, but who is it on? And that leads me to the third one, which is that anyone taking on this work needs to make sure that they're not solely relying on queer and trans people that they know or that they work with or have seen to lead this work, right? Or be a voice for all LGBTQ folks, because it's exhausting. That's an exhausting position to be in, right? You're already sort of dealing with all the problems that this work is trying to address, and you're meant to be the one who's fixing it as well. So the last thing that I will leave you, the second to last thing that I will leave you with are just some action steps. I kind of joked at the beginning that there aren't really a quick 3 things to do to start doing this work, but these are just some suggestions that are intentionally broad that I like to leave folks with, if nothing else. And so The first one is just start with yourself, right? What kind of identities do you hold? What privileges do they offer you? And in what situations? What power dynamics, again, do they create in conversations with the people that you interact with in your daily life? What privileges do those people who you do interact with, what work do they do that's informed by you or by themselves, right? How this has sort of a ripple effect, right? And starting with yourself, in my opinion, is a productive place to sort of dive into that. Second of all, start a conversation, right? Start talking to these people who is talking about this on your campus or in your community. And if no one's talking about it, start talking about it yourself. Again, especially if you're not a part of this community. This isn't a suggestion, of course, to become the leading voice on this, but rather to exercise the privilege that you have of not having to spend emotional energy on this and be directly impacted on it. Use that emotional energy to start these conversations and to create a space for this, because I guarantee that there are people in your day-to-day life who are looking to talk about this or have opinions or ideas and just don't have the space to do so. Then the last one is just commit to this learning process. It can be a very uncomfortable process, and I know it's kind of trendy at the moment to suggest sitting in the discomfort and not walking away from the conversation, but I think it's for good reason. And it can become uncomfortable, and you may be corrected, and you may get things wrong, but that's hopefully not a barrier of entry, because if it were, we wouldn't go anywhere, right? So my last suggestion there is just to remain a part of this work and stay in it and keep learning about yourself and your role in doing it. And so the very last thing I'll leave you with before I hopefully open it up to some questions, I think is something we can do, are just some resources. And I can also send this around or send it to Spencer and he'll send it around or something, some way you'll have this, just some resources that I have here for getting started in this work. A couple of them, the first one is just a sort of a language glossary put out by an organization called Teaching Tolerance, which is out of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I found it to be a really useful glossary of language to describe things in a way that makes sense. The last one is a report that I just put out, which is focused on preparing teachers to do this work better using OER in pre-K-12 specifically. But I think it has some applicable lessons and takeaways for higher ed as well. And all the ones in the middle are higher ed focused and resources for campuses and for faculty. So that is that. I'd love to take questions, Spencer, maybe if we're able to do that.
Yes, we do have time for questions. First of all, thank you so much, Sabia. Great overview, and I love the action steps as well. And I couldn't agree with you more that this inclusion work is exhausting, but it's not one and done, right? I thought that was a great way to frame it, and it is iterative, and we are building capacity by building up awareness with colleagues and with allies and with others in the community to make sure the burden doesn't fall on any one person or any one position, especially in the university structure. I mean, we see that time and time again. Oh, the diversity office handles this. Oh, the inclusion office will do those programs. Well, if this is interwoven through the fabric of the institution, it kind of relieves the burden from others on campus. So I agree with that point quite a bit. And thank you so much for sharing the resources. We do have one, I'm going to send you one question that came through on the chat. And so you can go ahead and take a look at that there. Do others have questions? Go ahead and speak up, or go ahead and send through a chat if you do.
I can go ahead and answer this question that is in the chat in the meantime. The question, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that inclusive curricula for all these sub-identities, is there an opportunity for that to actually become less inclusive and a space where students are maybe less likely to share opinions and views? And is there a happy balance that we can consider? At what point are we overcompensating? I think it's a really good question. And I do think, to answer it directly, I do think that there's an opportunity for that, right? There's an opportunity to turn more people off from this with every course of action that we might take from it. And I think that's a risk of this that is hard to get around. But I do think it's a risk that's able to be mitigated and depends heavily on who's leading this work and what barriers existed for those people who are leading the work to be part of it, right? I think that has everything to do with the success of this and how it plays out and the impact that it has on the communities that it's trying to serve. We have conversations like this a lot here at New America, even within our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, talking about what is keeping people from joining the committee, right? Because the committee decides lots of things that happen at the organization. I think this is the same for universities, right? There's maybe a small group of people, right, at least smaller than the entire community, that's making these decisions. And if those people were either self-selected by themselves or by other people with the same privileges that they have, the same experiences, the same voice, then that is really going to affect the types of work that they do and the things that they get wrong or get right. So I guess my advice around that is to be as aware as possible of how people are able to do this work and when they're not able to do this work and why.
Yeah, so that was my question. This is Sophia Gladden. Thank you so much for presenting to us. And this, I don't know if the part about the book I'm reading came through, but basically I'm reading a book called The Coddling of the American Mind right now, and how we're seeing a lot of backlash on university campuses related to speakers that don't align with student beliefs, or they don't believe that it's supportive to their campus culture. And I think that there's risk, and I've just seen this with other subgroups, and that's why I was sort of like, well, maybe we should ask, when you overdo it and you overcompensate to represent, especially like for instance in educational materials, it always has to be diverse. And then if you put, like all of one, subracial group or minority of some sort, or everyone's in a wheelchair in your OER materials, then sort of overcompensating on a level that is inauthentic, I guess is a good way to say it, which loses the credibility you have with the students. So I don't know. I wanted to know if you had an idea of what that balance was and how to avoid it. But yeah, that was a good answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and I think it could be a slippery slope again. And for people who are maybe to lead this work who don't belong to the communities that they're trying to serve, right? And it can be, it kind of reminds me of that meme. I don't actually know what this is from, but it's like an old guy dressed in like an AC/DC shirt, and he says like, "Hello, fellow kids," or something like that, right? It's like you're trying too hard to. He's like in high school. He's trying. That's a terrible description of it. But the point is that he's trying too hard to act like, to connect with, to use language that he's obviously been told is what this group of people that he's trying to reach use or want to hear or something like that, right? And I think, I think my answer is really just the same. It's to have voices at the table who are making this decision. Who are also in the group of people who you're trying to help or address or better serve, right? Because I think a lot of that can be avoided when the people experiencing the problem and the people trying to solve the problem are not two mutually exclusive groups.
Mm-hmm. Yes, collaboration. There you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking that question.
Thanks, Sophia. I think there are a couple more things coming through on the chat.
I see that. I see another one here.
Yeah, Lindsay had a question about, do you have any suggestions for survey language in allowing students to self-identify their gender? Obviously, we've seen the other category, but that is othering. Any other suggestions beyond that?
Right. right, literally othering. Yes, this is I don't have any, to answer your question, I don't have any sort of hard and fast language that I always use, but this is a conversation also that we have in this work a lot, because it's hard to do this work without talking so much about the lack of data around LGBTQ students, and why we don't have that data. And the language, to be honest, is a big part of why we don't have that. Certainly structural bias in how surveys are designed, but and for whom, but also just the challenges, right, of wording this correctly. And I think the piece about how our understanding and the language that we use to describe these identities changes over time is really important here, right? Because if you give the survey, if you were to give the same survey now, maybe one that you designed this year, to students, and then again 10 years from now, we probably wouldn't use the same words that you would use in the one you designed today, right? And that makes it hard. That makes it hard to collect longitudinal data, which makes it hard to collect to understand educational outcomes, right? We, as far as particular language on it, I like to see when people avoid the word other. That's usually a good thing. There are, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but I could send them around after in some way. There is research, actually, research on how to best phrase this, and there are a lot of best practices actually from the medical community, looking to understand correctly people's gender and sexual identities. So there is no sort of one correct answer for doing that, but there are people who have thought about the pros and cons of sort of every piece of language that you might include in that I'm happy to share around after this.
Thanks, Sabia. And then I know that Lindsay wanted to connect with you about our recently launched Equity Toolkit, so I'll make sure that two of you connect. I think Ryan had a question too about, he wanted to make sure that he could have access to the links at the end of your presentation. Mm-hmm. And then the main question was, are there quote unquote more friendly places to find OER resources that make this more obvious and easier to find? And then I think Ryan had some questions for the survey kind of question too, but maybe you can answer his OER question.
Yeah, survey did. Yeah, definitely. The answer is not that I know of at the moment, which is a big part of why I started doing this work. And again, sort of makes this work hard because you're advocating for something existing, and you don't have it to point people towards. At the moment in pre-K-12, again, I'll mention, just because that's where most of my knowledge is around this, there haven't been, up until now, there hadn't been any queer, inclusive, openly licensed teacher professional materials, teacher professional learning resources. And a lot of that we're learning is not because these resources don't exist, but because people don't know what open licensing is. The people who are creating them don't know what OER.
Oh, I think we lost your audio, Sabia.
Country, they're really excited about that piece of it. Sorry, I just disconnected. You all still hear me?
I think you're back now.
Okay. Am I good? You hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry. All right. It's a little rough. So a big piece of this work for me is, the big piece of the next stage of this work for me is identifying them all of the resources. I hope to do it for higher ed too, where they are, especially where openly licensed ones are, and hopefully putting them into, my idea for it is to put them into sort of a mapping tool, so that you'd be able to code for different types of resources that you're looking for and find them and find who authored them, and things like that. But as far as I know right now, that sort of thing does not exist.
Thank you. And are there any other, as we kind of close out, any other last questions before we finish up here?
hopefully this is an easy one. At the beginning of your slides, you shared a URL for newamerica.org, and then there was a slash. What was after the slash?
TLT, Teaching,
TLT.
Learning, and Tech, is our team.
Awesome.
And I will find some way to share this, hopefully with Spencer's help, maybe to share this with you all. And all the links in this are live, so you'll have
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think we'll link to the presentation in the video that we upload, if that works for you, Sabia.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Great. Well, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous pouring in through the chat. Thank you so much. We are really delighted that you were willing to connect with this group. I think this is really informative for us and helpful for us to take back to our campuses as well. And I'm hoping that this leads to further collaborations, especially as you continue to explore higher ed space. You know, if you need some testing grounds, I'm volunteering our campuses right now. But if you in all seriousness, if you want thought partners and continuing this work, please do keep us in mind. We're happy to support you. And thank you so much for the amazing work that you're doing.
Sorry, I'm lagging. Thank you. That means a lot. And yes, I'm interested in talking to absolutely anyone who's interested in this work, because it's really a team effort. And I'd be certainly interested to connect with any of you who have more questions or who I can be of service to.
Great. Thank you. And thank you all for joining. We'll have this posted online, and have a great weekend.